God's word. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of Man may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after hearing that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just trying to stone you, and are you going to go there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of the world. But those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So during our time of quarantine, social distancing, house arrest, shelter in place, whatever you would like to call it, I have been sharing funny Bible stories on Facebook just for a little bit of levity. I haven't done any from the New Testament yet, but John's Gospel especially might be a good candidate for some stories. It has multiple moments of irony and humor. There are 2 funny moments that I can think of in this story of raising Lazarus. The first is when Jesus is arguing with his disciples about going back in the direction of Jerusalem, where Bethany was and where they had just been. It's about a 25-mile walk from where they were at that point, and the religious authorities will be waiting to arrest him and trying to stone him. But Jesus says he has to do it because our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I am going to wake him up. And you can just see the incredulous stares on the disciples' faces as they say, "Rabbi, if he has just fallen asleep, he's going to make a full recovery. You don't have to be there to see it." Which I guess is, funny if you keep your standards low, and it helps when you have a congregation that you have trained to laugh at your jokes. But thank you, choir. Thank you for that. But the second moment of humor occurs right at the climax of the entire story. As you know by now, it is a bit of a long story. It's a story with a carefully constructed narrative. It's written in the larger context of early Jewish Christians being systematically expelled from synagogues and ostracized by first-century Jewish leaders. It's a story chock full of weighty theological themes, religious symbols, and allegory. I am the resurrection and the life. This illness does not lead to death, but through it the Son of Man will be glorified. Those who walk during the day will not stumble because they see the light of the world. Everyone who believes in me will never die. And finally, it's also a story because of its theological importance that is often read at memorial services. So it has this moment towards the climax. And whenever I read it at a memorial service, I'm trying to keep a somber tone as the text describes how Jesus was deeply moved and he began to weep, and how some onlookers saw this as proof of how much he truly loved Lazarus, while others asked why he couldn't keep Lazarus from ever dying in the first place. And as the listener, you're anticipating the miracle before it happens, and then the dramatic moment arrives, and Jesus powerfully commands, Take away the stone. When Martha interrupts and just looks around at everyone and says, Lord, what about the smell? He's been dead 4 days, you know. Or as it says in the King James Version, Lord, by this time he stinketh. And so usually at the funeral it is a grandson or a nephew who is trying to hide a smirk or suppress his laughter because, let's admit it, it's kind of funny. I'm never really exactly sure how to read it as it breaks up that dramatic moment. I've even briefly considered taking that line out when I read this passage at a funeral. But actually, that is John's point. It's meant to be funny. It's funny because of our own lack of faith. It's funny because of our own healthy doubt, curiosity, and skepticism. It's funny for the same basic reason the other Bible stories I've been sharing on Facebook this week are funny. Because when you refuse to suspend your disbelief and instead sneak a peek behind the veil, as it were, it's all rather absurd. You really think Samson was surprised by what Delilah did to him? You really think Isaac was fooled by his own son claiming to be his brother just because he changed his voice and put fur on his arms? You really think Jesus brought a man back from the dead? I mean, just how would that work, even? See, I kind of see Martha as the too smart for his own good, rabble-rousing, teenage preacher's kid that is inside of me. You know, I'm a preacher's kid and was a preacher's kid before I ever was a preacher. You know, the one with the smirk who raises his hand in the middle of the Sunday school lesson and says, Bruh, if Jesus really brought that guy back from the dead, just think about how bad it would have smelled. And yet, I don't think it was any coincidence that within this story, that line was given to Martha, who just a few verses earlier made her profession of faith, saying, Jesus, I believe you, O Lord, are the Messiah. You are the Son of God. You are the one who is coming into the world. Because what Martha is actually doing here is insisting to the reader to take this story seriously, to consider what it means if what happened is really real. It cuts through all of the allegory and symbolism and rhetoric and obtuse theological language to something that is practical and concrete and as literally down to earth as it gets. The smell. Lord, there will be a stench. When you were writing this story, when you were preparing for its dramatization, did you stop and think about the smell? Because, friends, that is the power of the gospel. That is the reason the resurrection is an absolute miracle. Because we have been so inoculated from death in first world, 21st century life, especially now when everything is sanitized and sterilized. Funeral homes these days do so much to the bodies of our deceased loved ones, with clothes and makeup, etc., that in line with this story, when we go to see them before they're laid to rest, they don't look like they're really dead, but merely sleeping and could wake up at any moment. And even as Christians, with our theology, Lent is our least favorite time of year, the time when we are supposed to contemplate death and the cross, especially this year. We don't want to think about what death really means. Think about it. If you only come to church on Sundays, during the end of Lent, you skip from the children singing and dancing and parading on Palm Sunday straight to the Christ is risen chorus with the brass band on Easter morning the following week, conveniently omitting the cross, the suffering, the death. And in our personal lives, how often do we so easily say, "Oh, Grandma is with us in spirit," or, "Well, I just see death as a speed bump," or, "I don't believe in saying goodbye, only see you soon." But again, this story puts in our face that the power of the gospel, the miracle of resurrection, is so much bigger and better than that. It is truly a miracle. Mary and Martha had been with their brother when he got sick. They had surely stayed with him while he was dying. They were probably right next to him when he breathed his last, as he suffered in his pain, waiting for death to take him. They had already cried many tears. They were working to accept that he was gone. They had said goodbye. They were not trying to give the theologically appropriate, over-spiritualized answer to Jesus. They were not so far removed from death. So Martha knew if Jesus wanted to take away the stone and go see Lazarus' body, he should know that he's already been in there 4 days. Their brother is gone. It is just a decomposing corpse, and it is going to stink. And that's why this miracle is so powerful. That's why the story of Christ can change the world. Because Christ's gospel does not deny that death is real. What we believe isn't just make-believe, that when a Christian dies, their soul or their consciousness just merely floats on up to heaven, because these bodies in this earth are just experiments, just little tests to see who is worthy of the real life to live forever. No, in Christ we believe that God takes something that has been truly dead and buried and stinking and decomposing in the ground, unrecognizable dry bones, and makes them live again. Physically, tangibly embodied. And we read this story of Lazarus during Lent to remind us that the reality of death is inescapable. And that if death isn't real, if it's just a state of mind, just a speed bump, just an illusion, then the resurrection is an illusion as well. I guess another irony of this story, which I don't think there's any way the writer of John's Gospel could have ever anticipated, is that so many Christians today are hearing it proclaimed virtually through a voice coming out of a smartphone or a laptop. Maybe you're not even hearing it on Sunday morning. You're hearing it transmitted over space and time. You can't feel the cool air of our chilly sanctuary whose heater likes to go out from time to time. You can't feel the hard back of the wooden pews, or smell the familiar smell of sacred space where this congregation has gathered almost without fail at 11 o'clock every single Sunday for much longer than I've been alive until now. That we must practice our faith this way right now is a kind of death. Something that we have to take time to feel, to accept, to grieve. And yes, during even Lent, we do need good news. And it is lovely to hear the stories that have been going around of connection and community that are sprouting up and refuse to be stifled by a pandemic, like weeds that grow in the cracks of the sidewalk. It is lovely to hear how churches are seeing more viewers on their brand new live streams than they ever saw in the form of bodies in the sanctuary. It is moving to find out how students and teachers and fiancés and entertainers and cooks and business owners are being incredibly creative, giving birth to new ways of life all around, even in the midst of this unprecedented challenge. But the true power and beauty of the new thing that is happening can only be fully grasped and celebrated if we allow ourselves to accept what has been lost, what has been robbed of us. Not only is it okay, it is actually essential right now for us not to simply put on a happy face and pretend like, oh, we're doing just fine, considering. Considering what? Considering the grandkids had to cancel their trip. considering there's no baseball game on at night to numb the loneliness, considering those memories of senior prom we fantasized about making will remain largely memories. Will remain fantasies. Considering the loneliness we already felt living in a retirement home is now even worse since we're not allowed visitors. Considering the milestone birthday celebration will be you eating cake by yourself in front of a screen. Considering that Granddad might not be around to attend when the wedding finally gets rescheduled. Lent is a time to grieve. Yes, sometimes the grief is too raw. Sometimes we need to numb ourselves with online videos and scrolling through news feeds and immersing ourselves in partisan politics. But if what we say is true, and we really are going to come out for the better because of this, if God really is going to use this for good, for resurrection, for new life, then I hope we will allow ourselves to acknowledge the stench, to lament, and cry out that this way of living has never been God's plan or God's will. And it is hard. And I guess during Lent, what we can say is that when we are in that dark place, that smelly place, we are not alone. Funny enough. Christ has gone before us. Christ is with us. Christ was God coming near to the world. And then the cross was him socially distancing himself. Christ, too, was quarantined into hell alongside us. Christ is present in the frantic emergency rooms, in the empty place where you have to have worship. And Christ is present even now as we lament, as we begin to weep. Christ puts his arms of love and hope so fully around us that we can feel his presence. Thanks be to him. Amen.